When Nolan Cassidy handed over that crumpled dollar bill for 100 acres of Montana rangeland, he thought he'd bought himself a slice of heaven. But opening the door to find a rifle barrel pointed at his chest and a fierce-eyed woman demanding, "Who the hell are you?" wasn't part of the deal. At 28, Nolan had worked cattle ranches from Texas to Wyoming, saving every penny for this moment, owning his own spread. 6 years of dawn to dusk labor, sleeping in bunkhouses and eating trail dust, all for the chance to build something lasting in the Montana Territory's rolling grasslands. But what Nolan discovered inside that seemingly abandoned ranch house, and the choice he made when 3 armed riders came hunting for the woman protecting secrets worth more than gold, would transform a simple land purchase into a fight for justice that would change both their lives forever. The year was 1887, and Montana Territory was still wild country where a man's claim to land could be settled by Winchester or Colt, depending on who wanted it more. The town of Cedar Falls, 15 miles east of Nolan's new property, had grown around silver mining operations that drew every manner of fortune seeker from honest prospectors working their claims with pick and shovel, to claim jumpers like the Maddox brothers who preferred stealing what others had found. The grasslands stretched endlessly under big sky country, painted gold and green by summer sun, where cattle could graze for miles without seeing a fence post. But beneath that peaceful surface lay veins of gold and silver that had turned neighbors into enemies and honest men into killers. Territorial law struggled to keep pace with rapid expansion, and justice often came from a man's own hand rather than a judge's gavel. In this land of opportunity and violence, a person's word and their ability to back it up meant everything. Sometimes the difference between prosperity and an unmarked grave. Nolan's journey west began in tragedy 6 years ago when a flash flood wiped out his family's Kansas farm, taking his parents and younger sister with it, left with nothing but grief and determination. He'd headed for cattle country, learning to rope and ride from Mexican vaqueros and grizzled trail bosses, every blister on his hands, every bone-jarring night sleeping on hard ground, every dollar saved instead of spent on whiskey or gambling, had been building toward this dream-owning land that no flood, no banker, no rich man could take away. His family's loss had taught him that the only security came from what a man could hold and defend with his own 2 hands. By summer of 1887, Nolan had earned a reputation as a reliable hand who could gentle wild horses and move cattle through any terrain. His 6 years of careful living had accumulated $247 in savings, not much by most standards, but enough to start small if a man was willing to work hard and live lean. When he heard Boone Carter was selling his Montana ranch for practically nothing, Nolan saw opportunity knocking. The seller claimed he was heading to California for his health, needed a quick sale, and didn't care about getting full value. It seemed too good to be true, which should have been Nolan's first warning. Nolan possessed qualities rarer than gold in the territory, an unshakable moral compass, and the skill to back up his convictions. 6 years of range work had taught him to read men's intentions in their eyes and to handle trouble before it escalated. His reputation for fairness had earned respect from ranch owners and cowboys alike. He'd never started a fight, but he'd finished several when defending weaker men from bullies. Most importantly, Nolan understood that true strength came from protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. This conviction, forged by losing his own family, would soon be tested in ways he never expected. The Maddox brothers Ezra and Caleb had been systematically acquiring valuable mining claims throughout the territory through intimidation, fraud, and violence. Their method was ruthlessly efficient: identify promising claims, eliminate the owners through accidents or forced sales, then work the mines using hired guns to discourage questions from territorial authorities. Thomas Quade's gold claim had been their latest target, but the stubborn prospector had refused to sell despite mounting pressure. When Quade died in what appeared to be a mining accident, the brothers moved to claim his property through legal manipulation. However, they hadn't counted on Thomas's daughter Iris, who possessed not only her father's surveying documents proving the claim's true value, but also evidence of the brothers' criminal methods. Her disappearance with those documents had driven the Maddox operation underground, but they'd never stopped hunting for her. Now, with Nolan's arrival at the ranch where she'd been hiding, a 3-year game of cat and mouse was about to become deadly serious. But as Nolan approached the weathered ranch house with his deed in hand and dreams in his heart, he had no idea he was about to walk into the middle of a war that had already claimed one life and would soon claim more unless he chose a side. The ranch house looked abandoned from the outside: weathered wood siding, overgrown garden, missing fence posts that spoke of years without proper care. But something felt wrong as Nolan approached the front porch. The windows were too clean for an empty house, and smoke wisps rose from the chimney on this warm July day. His hand instinctively moved to his Colt .45 as he pushed open the front door. "Hold it right there, mister, or I'll put a hole through you big enough to drive cattle through." The voice was female, young, and deadly serious. In the dim interior, Nolan could make out a slender figure holding a Winchester rifle with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it. As his eyes adjusted, he saw her clearly, maybe 22 years old, with auburn hair tied back and green eyes that sparked with intelligence and wariness. She wore men's work clothes that had seen hard use, and her stance suggested she'd been expecting trouble for a long time. "Easy there, miss," Nolan said, keeping his hands visible. "I'm Nolan Cassidy, and I just bought this property from Boone Carter. Got the deed right here in my pocket." He gestured slowly toward his shirt pocket. "Mind if I show it to you?" The woman, Iris. She called herself, studied Nolan's deed with the careful attention of someone who'd learned not to trust documents or the men who carried them. Her explanation of the situation hit Nolan like a kicked horse. She'd been living here for 3 years, maintaining the property after her father's death, and Boone Carter had no legal right to sell what he'd never properly owned. "Carter bought this place at a tax auction," Iris explained, her rifle still trained on Nolan's chest. "But the auction was rigged. My pa paid his taxes regular-like, but certain folks made sure those payments never reached the territorial office." Her voice carried the weight of old anger and fresh grief. "Pa's been dead 3 years now, but I kept this place running, hoping someday the truth would come out." Nolan faced a choice that went beyond simple property rights. His life savings were tied up in this land purchase, and walking away would mean starting over with nothing. But something in Iris's eyes, a combination of fierce determination and barely controlled fear told him there was more to this story than a disputed land sale. "Why don't you start from the beginning, Miss?" Nolan asked, deliberately settling into a chair despite her rifle. The gesture showed trust, and he saw her grip relax slightly in response. "And maybe you could point that Winchester somewhere else while you're talking. I'm not going anywhere until I understand what I've stepped into." Iris lowered her rifle, but kept it within easy reach as she began her story. Thomas Quaid had been a careful prospector who'd filed proper claims on what turned out to be one of the richest gold deposits in the territory. But his discovery had attracted the wrong kind of attention, specifically from the Maddox brothers, who specialized in acquiring valuable claims through methods that wouldn't stand up in any honest court. Pa knew they were coming for him, Iris continued, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. He gave me copies of all his surveying documents. Told me to hide if anything happened to him. 3 days later, his mind collapsed with him inside it. She met Nolan's gaze directly. "Weren't no accident. Mr. Cassidy." The Maddox boys have been using that same story to acquire claims from here to Helena. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through their conversation like a knife. Iris went pale as she peered through the window. "3 riders coming fast from the south," she whispered, grabbing her rifle. "You need to leave now. Mr. Cassidy, these men aren't here to discuss property deeds. And anyone found with me tends to end up dead." But as those riders drew closer, their leader's face became visible through the dust. Wade Harper, the Maddox brothers' enforcer and the man who'd murdered Thomas Quaid. This wasn't going to be a conversation about property rights. This was about to become a fight for survival. Nolan moved to the window beside Iris, studying the approaching riders with the practiced eye of someone who'd faced trouble before. Wade Harper rode Point Aline, dangerous man with dead eyes and a reputation for solving problems with hot lead. The 2 men flanking him were cut from the same cloth-hired guns who'd kill for money and sleep sound afterward. "How many times have they come looking for you?" Nolan asked quietly. Iris's knuckles were white on her rifle stock. "This makes the 4th time in 3 months. Usually I spot 'em early and hide in the old root cellar until they move on. But with you here—" She didn't need to finish. His presence had changed the equation completely. Harper reined in his horse 50 yards from the house, close enough to make conversation, but far enough to avoid surprise gunfire. "Cassidy," he called out, somehow already knowing Nolan's name. "You picked a hell of a bad time to buy yourself some property. That girl in there with you is a thief and a liar, and she's got something that belongs to my employers." His voice carried the lazy confidence of a man who'd had this conversation before and knew how it usually ended. "Send her out with those documents, and you can keep breathing. Simple business transaction, nothing personal about it." The threat escalated when Harper's men began spreading out to surround the house. "Course, if you're feeling stubborn about it," Harper continued, his hand resting casually on his pistol grip, "we can always settle this the hard way. Had to do that with her pa, and it surely was a shame. Mining accidents happen so easy when a man don't watch his step." The taunt was designed to provoke Iris into doing something foolish, but Nolan saw her jaw tighten with control rather than rage. She'd learned patience in 3 years of hiding, but Harper's casual mention of her father's murder was testing every limit of that hard-won discipline. Harper played his psychological cards with the skill of a professional intimidator. "Heard you paid old Boone Carter a whole $1 for this spread. Cassidy, that's about what it's worth with the kind of trouble that follows this girl around, but I'm feeling generous today." He gestured toward his men, who had completed their positioning around the house. "Ride away right now, and you can keep that $1 and your life. Stay, and you'll end up like Thomas Quaid, another mining accident. Real tragic-like." The external pressure extended beyond immediate physical danger. Harper's presence meant the Maddox brothers knew exactly where Iris had been hiding, suggesting they had informants throughout the territory who'd been watching and waiting. "See, the thing is," Harper continued, "we know about every place you might run to, every person who might help you. 3 years is a long time to build a network, and we've been patient, but patience has its limits, and the Maddox boys are tired of waiting." The implication was clear. Even if Iris escaped this confrontation, she'd never be safe anywhere in Montana territory. The brothers had turned her entire world into a trap, and Nolan's arrival had simply triggered the final phase of their hunt. Unless something changed dramatically, this ranch would become both their first home together and their final resting place. In that moment of supreme danger, Nolan felt something crystallize inside him like water turning to ice. For 6 years, he'd focused solely on acquiring land and building security for himself. But looking at Iris, seeing the courage it had taken to survive 3 years alone, protecting her father's legacy against men who killed without conscience, he realized that some things transcended personal ambition. This wasn't just about whether he'd been cheated on a land deal anymore. This was about justice, about protecting someone who'd already lost everything to greedy men who took what they wanted through violence. The protective instincts that had driven him west after losing his family came roaring back to life, but tempered now by years of hard-won experience and skill. Nolan understood that saving Iris would mean giving up his dream of peaceful ranch life, at least temporarily. It would require him to fight men who had every advantage: numbers, local knowledge, and a willingness to kill without hesitation. But for the first time since leaving Kansas, he felt truly alive, driven by a purpose that went beyond mere survival or profit. He was no longer just a drifting cowboy who'd stumbled into someone else's fight. He was choosing to become the kind of man his family would have been proud of, regardless of the cost. Harper's confidence suggested he held advantages Nolan couldn't see yet. "Time's wasting, Cassidy," he called out, pulling his pocket watch with theatrical precision. "My boys get restless when negotiations drag on too long. Restless men make unfortunate decisions. If you catch my meaning." The implied deadline was clear. This conversation had a time limit, after which violence would become inevitable. But Harper's final card was the most dangerous: "Course. We know you got no backup coming. Sheriff Bennett's been bought and paid for, and the nearest territorial marshal is 3 days' ride from here." Amazing how isolated a man can feel when he realizes he's truly on his own. The words carried the weight of absolute conviction, suggesting Harper had orchestrated this confrontation down to the smallest detail. Even more ominous was his casual reference to other accidents that had befallen people who tried to help Iris in the past 3 years. Harper wasn't just threatening Nolan and Iris. He was promising that anyone who stood against the Maddox operation would face swift, brutal retribution. The message was clear surrender now, or join the growing list of people who'd underestimated the brothers' reach and ruthlessness. But just as Harper reached for his gun, confident that fear would break Nolan's resolve, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the valley, and the badge glinting on the lead rider's chest would change everything Harper thought he knew about this confrontation. Harper's face went from confident to confused as Sheriff Bennett and 2 deputies crested the ridge. Riding hard toward the ranch house, this wasn't part of his carefully orchestrated plan. Bennett was supposed to be 50 miles away, investigating a reported claim dispute that would keep him busy for days. Harper's network of informants had apparently failed him at the worst possible moment. "Well, I'll be damned," Harper muttered, his hand moving away from his gun as he tried to recalculate the odds. 3 against 2 had been manageable, but 6 against 3 with lawmen involved changed everything. What Harper didn't know was that one of his own men, a conscience-stricken cowboy named Pete Donovan, had ridden to Cedar Falls the night before, finally ready to testify about Thomas Quade's murder after 3 years of guilt. Sheriff Bennett reined in his horse between Harper and the house, his weathered face grim with purpose. "Wade Harper," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years wearing a badge. "You're under arrest for the murder of Thomas Quade." The sheriff's hand rested on his gun butt with the casual confidence of a man who'd survived more gunfights than he cared to count. Harper's carefully constructed web of corruption and intimidation was unraveling faster than a rope in a windstorm. Pete Donovan's testimony had provided the missing piece Bennett needed to build a case against the Maddox operation. Worse still, Donovan had revealed the location of Thomas Quade's real claim documents hidden in the mine shaft where he'd been murdered, protected in a waterproof container that had survived 3 years of Montana weather. The standoff that Harper had orchestrated to eliminate the last witness to his crimes had instead brought together all the evidence needed to destroy him and his employers. Harper's options had narrowed to 2 equally desperate choices. He could surrender peacefully, hoping that his connections to territorial politicians might still protect him in court. But Pete Donovan's testimony, combined with Iris's eyewitness account and the physical evidence from the mine, would be enough to see him hanged. Even the Maddox brothers' money couldn't buy him out of a murder conviction with that much evidence. The alternative was to fight his way out, gambling that he could eliminate Bennett and his deputies before they could take him alive. But Harper was a killer, not a suicide case. 6 against 3 odds in open ground favored the lawman, especially with Nolan and Iris providing additional firepower from the house. Even if he won the gunfight, surviving would only buy him time until federal marshals arrived to hunt him down. "You know, Sheriff," Harper said, his voice taking on the reasonable tone of a man discussing cattle prices, "there seems to be some kind of misunderstanding here. I'm just a businessman conducting legitimate business with these folks. Any accusations about past events are just the desperate lies of a girl who's been living wild in these mountains for 3 years. But Sheriff Bennett had dealt with Harper's kind of legitimate business before." Funny thing about that, Wade, Pete Donovan rode into my office last night with a real interesting story about how Thomas Quade died. Amazing How guilty consciences finally catch up with a man after 3 years of sleepless nights. The sheriff's words hit Harper like physical blows, revealing just how completely his network of silence and intimidation had collapsed. Harper realized he was facing not just arrest, but the complete destruction of everything the Maddox brothers had built through 20 years of crime and corruption. "Harper," Sheriff Bennett continued, his voice dropping to the tone he'd used arresting killers throughout his career, "you've got two choices here. You can surrender peaceful-like and take your chances with a jury, or you can go for that gun and die in the dirt like the rabid dog you are." The ultimatum carried absolute finality. Backed by decades of experience dealing with desperate men inside the house, Nolan felt Iris tense beside him as she recognized the moment of ultimate decision. For 3 years, she'd lived in hiding, always running, always looking over her shoulder for the men who'd killed her father. But now, with Harper finally cornered and facing justice, she had the chance to step out of the shadows and reclaim her life. "Mr. Cassidy," she whispered, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Whatever happens next, I want you to know having someone stand beside me means more than you'll ever understand." Her words carried the weight of 3 years of loneliness and fear, but also the hope that this nightmare might finally end. Harper's hand moved toward his gun, and time seemed to slow as every man in that valley prepared for violence that would determine not just who lived or died, but whether justice would finally prevail in Montana territory. But Harper's final desperate gamble would reveal one last secret about the Quaid claim information that would transform Iris from a hunted fugitive into the wealthiest woman in the territory, and make Nolan's $1 investment worth more than either of them ever dreamed possible. Harper's desperation transformed into the reckless calculation of a man with nothing left to lose. "You want to know the truth about Thomas Quaid's claim, Sheriff?" he snarled, his facade of civilized menace finally cracking completely. "That stubborn old fool was sitting on the richest gold vein in the entire territory, maybe the richest between here and California. His surveying maps show enough gold to make a man richer than railroad barons." Sheriff Bennett's expression didn't change, but his grip tightened on his weapon. "So you killed him for his claim maps. That's what this has all been about, gold fever and murder." Harper's admission was sealing his own fate. But he seemed beyond caring about consequences now. "Those documents that girl's been hiding aren't just claim papers," Harper continued, gesturing wildly toward the house. "They're geological surveys worth millions, and the Maddox boys have spent 3 years trying to get their hands on them. Every mine we've taken, every accident we've arranged, has been building toward claiming the Quaid strike." He laughed bitterly. "Cassidy bought himself a ranch for $1, but he's really bought himself a gold mine worth a fortune that could change the entire territory." The revelation changed everything in that valley. Nolan felt Iris stiffen beside him as Harper's words confirmed what her father had suspected, but never lived to prove. His claim wasn't just valuable. It was extraordinary, but the knowledge came with a terrible price. Everyone now knew exactly why the Maddox brothers would never stop hunting her. "That changes nothing about your arrest, Harper," Sheriff Bennett said firmly, though his eyes showed he understood the implications. A gold strike of that magnitude would draw every fortune hunter and claim jumper in the West. Even with Harper in custody, Iris would face constant danger from men seeking to steal her inheritance through violence or legal manipulation. Harper sensed the shift in dynamics and pressed his advantage. "You think arresting me solves anything? Sheriff, the Maddox boys have connections reaching all the way to the territorial capital. They'll have that claim tied up in court for years while they work it illegally, and that girl will mysteriously disappear long before any legal proceedings conclude." His confidence was returning as he realized the scope of political corruption protecting his employers. The standoff had evolved from a simple arrest into a complex struggle for control of one of the richest discoveries in Western mining history. Harper's hand dropped toward his gun, but his desperation made him sloppy. Sheriff Bennett drew faster than a rattlesnake strike, putting 2 bullets center mass before Harper could clear leather. The killer dropped to his knees, then pitched forward into the Montana dirt, his dreams of gold and violence bleeding out under the summer sun. But Harper's death triggered chaos as his 2 associates, seeing their leader fall, decided their best chance lay in eliminating witnesses rather than facing territorial justice. Dutch Malloy went for his rifle while Billy Santos drew his pistol, both men calculating that 3 corpses would be easier to explain than testimony that could expose the entire Maddox operation. Nolan shoved Iris behind the heavy wooden table and returned fire through the window, his first shot taking Malloy in the shoulder and spinning him away from his rifle. Sheriff Bennett's deputies flanked Santos, catching him in crossfire that ended his threat permanently. The gunfight lasted less than 30 seconds, but it marked the end of 3 years of fear and the beginning of justice for Thomas Quaid. As the gunsmoke cleared, Sheriff Bennett approached Harper's body to confirm what everyone already knew. Wade Harper's reign of terror in Montana Territory was finished, but the sheriff's grim expression suggested that Harper's death solved only part of their problem. "Miss Quaid," he called toward the house, "I'm going to need you to testify about everything you've witnessed over the past 3 years. With Harper dead and Donovan's testimony, we can finally build cases against the Maddox brothers." Iris emerged from the house slowly, her rifle still ready, but her posture showing relief for the first time in years. "Sheriff Bennett, I've got more than just testimony. Papa hid detailed records of every illegal claim the Maddox boys took, every murder they arranged, every territorial official they bribed." She gestured toward a loose floorboard near the fireplace. 3 years' worth of evidence, all waiting for someone honest enough to use it. The revelation promised to expose corruption reaching the highest levels of territorial government, but it also meant Iris would need protection during months of legal proceedings, as the Maddox brothers would certainly attempt to silence her before she could testify. The immediate danger had passed, but the larger battle for justice was just beginning, and Iris would be the primary target until every corrupt official and hired killer was behind bars or underground. Nolan made his decision with the clarity that comes from absolute conviction. "Sheriff, if Miss Quaid needs protection during these legal proceedings, she's got it right here." He gestured toward the ranch house with its strong walls and defensive positions. "This place has kept her safe for 3 years, and with proper preparation. It can keep her safe until every last one of these bastards faces justice." Sheriff Bennett nodded approvingly. "Mr. Cassidy, I was hoping you'd say something like that. The territorial marshal will want to station deputies here, but having someone with your reputation backing the play makes all the difference." The lawman's respect was earned through Nolan's actions during the confrontation, standing firm against overwhelming odds and protecting an innocent woman from professional killers. But Iris surprised them both with her response. "Mr. Cassidy, you bought this land fair and square, even if you didn't know what you were getting. But my papa's claim papers show his property line extends right through the middle of what you thought you owned. Legally speaking, we're partners, whether we planned it or not." She extended her hand with a smile that transformed her entire face. "Question is, are you willing to work with a partner who comes with gold mines and gunfighters both?" Nolan clasped her hand without hesitation. "Miss Quaid, I'd say that's the best business proposition I've ever heard. Partners it is, through whatever comes next." Their handshake sealed more than a business arrangement. It marked the beginning of an alliance that would reshape the Montana Territory's mining industry and their own destinies. Sheriff Bennett supervised the removal of the bodies, while Iris and Nolan examined the claim documents that had caused so much bloodshed. Thomas Quaid's meticulous surveys revealed not just gold deposits of extraordinary richness, but also detailed evidence of the Maddox brothers' systematic criminal enterprise. Maps showing fraudulent claim boundaries, records of bribes paid to territorial officials, and witness statements about mining accidents that were actually murders, all carefully preserved by a man who'd known his life was in danger. "Papa always said the truth would come out eventually," Iris murmured, handling the documents with reverence for her father's memory. "He just didn't live to see it happen." But her grief was tempered by satisfaction that justice would finally be served, not just for Thomas Quaid, but for every honest prospector the Maddox brothers had cheated or killed. Nolan marveled at the scope of wealth the surveys revealed. His $1 investment had purchased a partnership in what might be the richest gold strike in territorial history. But more importantly, it had given him something he'd been searching for without realizing it, a purpose worth fighting for and someone worth protecting with his life. As Sheriff Bennett prepared to depart with his prisoners and evidence, he offered final words of caution. "The Maddox boys still have men scattered across the territory, and news of Harper's death will reach them within days. You two should expect more trouble before this is finished." But his tone suggested confidence in their ability to handle whatever came next. Nolan and Iris had proven themselves in the crucible of violence, emerging as a formidable partnership that combined his tactical skills with her intimate knowledge of the criminal network they faced. The ranch that had sheltered her would now become their fortress. But neither Nolan nor Iris realized that Harper's death was just the opening move in a larger game. The Maddox brothers' response would test their partnership in ways they never imagined, transforming their gold strike into the foundation of a mining empire that would reshape Montana Territory forever. Within a week of Harper's death, territorial authorities had arrested Ezra Maddox in Helena, while his brother Caleb fled toward the Canadian border with federal marshals in pursuit. Iris's testimony, combined with Thomas Quaid's meticulously preserved evidence, exposed a criminal network that had operated with impunity for nearly a decade. Corrupt territorial officials found themselves under investigation, while honest lawmen finally had the evidence needed to clean up Montana's mining districts, the Quaid claim, properly surveyed and legally registered, proved even richer than Thomas's initial estimates suggested. Working with reputable mining engineers from Denver, Nolan and Iris established the Quaid Cassidy Mining Company, implementing safety standards and fair wage practices that became models for the entire territory. Their success attracted honest investors and skilled miners, transforming the remote ranch into the center of a thriving mining community that prioritized worker safety over maximum profit extraction. The partnership between Nolan and Iris catalyzed reforms throughout Montana's mining industry that extended far beyond their individual success. Their insistence on honest business practices and transparent dealings with territorial authorities helped establish legal precedents that protected small miners from the kind of systematic exploitation the Maddox brothers had perfected. The Quaid Cassidy Company's success proved that ethical mining operations could be more profitable long-term than criminal enterprises built on violence and fraud. Their mining community grew into the town of Quaid's Crossing, named in honor of Thomas Quaid's memory and the justice his daughter had finally secured. The town became a sanctuary for miners seeking honest work and fair treatment, attracting families who valued safety and stability over the boom and bust cycles that characterized most mining settlements. Schools, churches, and hospitals followed the initial success, creating a model community that other territories studied and emulated. Most significantly, Iris and Nolan's story became legend throughout the West, proof that ordinary people could stand against corruption and violence when they found the courage to fight for justice. Their example inspired other victims of claim jumping and territorial corruption to come forward, leading to widespread reforms in mining law and territorial governance that extended from Montana to Colorado and beyond, fundamentally changing how the West was won and settled. Nolan evolved from a drifting cowboy seeking land ownership into one of Montana's most influential businessmen and advocates for mining reform. His protection of Iris had awakened leadership qualities he'd never known he possessed, transforming him into someone who attracted and inspired others to build something lasting and meaningful. The ranch he'd bought for $1 became headquarters of an empire built on principle rather than exploitation. Iris grew from a hunted fugitive into a powerful woman who used her wealth and influence to ensure that other families wouldn't suffer what hers had endured. Her father's murder had forged unshakable determination to fight corruption and protect the vulnerable, making her one of the territory's most effective advocates for honest governance and workers' rights. Their story proved that justice delayed isn't always justice denied. Sometimes it requires the right people meeting at the perfect moment to transform tragedy into triumph. When ordinary courage meets extraordinary circumstances, even a $1 investment in land can yield returns measured not just in gold, but in human dignity and lasting change.